The original Gran Turismo changed the face of console racing games forever, and helped transform a small internal team into a powerhouse development studio. Yet while these first two Gran Turismo games were extremely impressive and popular for their era, it was clear that the vision had not been fully realized. Our first vision of this future then would arrive just in time for the new millennium. So let us continue with the next part of the DF Retro Gran Turismo Retrospective.
次世代機の名称を皆様にお知らせしたいというふうに思います。すごく簡単に PlayStation 2ということで、正式名称 PlayStation 2させていただきたいと思います。
September 13th, 1999. After months of speculation, Sony finally unveiled PlayStation 2 to the world. PlayStation 2 would represent a next-generation leap in visuals, along with support for DVD media and an enhanced DualShock controller. Plus, it would feature full backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1. During TGS, Sony shared demos of future PlayStation 2 software titles, including games from Namco and Koei. But what really caught our attention at the time was this. A demonstration of Gran Turismo running on PlayStation 2. Titled Gran Turismo 2000, this demo represented the next generation for the franchise. It was clear that key improvements were in play, including more realistic reflections and lighting, as well as a higher frame rate and more detailed vehicles. There exists precious little footage of this demo today, but rest assured, it made a strong impact upon reveal, and was often featured in news clips. The thing is, this occurred just 2 weeks after the launch of Sega Dreamcast in North America, and this is where things get interesting. The Sega Dreamcast first launched in late '98 in Japan, but had just arrived in North America as of 9/9/99, and of course, I was there day one. I loved the system, but it fell below expectations when it came to one genre, racing games. Sure, games like Tokyo Extreme Racer were a lot of fun, and ran at a smooth 60 frames per second, which looked great, but it was rather sparse compared to what Sega had released in the arcades years prior, and that's kind of what I had been hoping for. The only Model 3 racing game that would arrive on Dreamcast was Sega Rally 2, but this was hampered by Windows CE and runs with a very inconsistent frame rate, along with downgraded visuals. Of course, Sega and others had many other games in the works. Gran Turismo's success certainly hadn't gone unnoticed after all. Thus, just before the launch of PlayStation 2 in Japan, Sega unleashed Sega GT, Homologation Special. Developed in partnership with Tosei, Sega GT was designed very directly to compete with Gran Turismo. Now, Sega were the kings of the arcade racer, but the more complex CarPG progression of GT represented something new. Like Gran Turismo, Sega GT has a full career mode that has you starting with lower end vehicles while working your way up via winning races and tuning cars. Problem is, the game feels somewhat floaty and imprecise to me with the Dreamcast controller, and the sense of speed is somewhat lacking. I mean, let's look at Gran Turismo 2 again. Yeah, it's much less visually impressive, but the textures are what I like to call speed textures, and that they're specifically created to enhance the feeling of momentum, with those almost vertical lines in the texture. Sega GT really lacks in this area, and it uses a narrow FOV, so the whole thing just feels slow. Also, car models fall well short of what was being teased on PlayStation 2, though honestly, they're still decent enough. And they are a big step up from Gran Turismo 2 on the PlayStation. The environments aren't half bad either, just a little sparse. Problem is, the whole game runs at just 30 frames per second, an upgrade over PS1, but a huge step back from what Sega was doing in the arcades, and certainly from what Sony was promising with PlayStation 2. Ultimately, Sega GT, while decent, didn't make a dent in the market, although it did receive a sequel on the original Xbox a couple years later. But games like Ferrari F355 Challenge from AM2 were a much more impressive showcase, moving at a smooth 60 frames per second with beautifully detailed vehicles. This one was based on a realistic driving simulator with 3 screens created for arcades, and F355 showcased Dreamcast at its best. Alas, as you may have guessed from the name, the game focuses entirely on the Ferrari F355. I always thought that this could have been a great basis for a real Gran Turismo competitor, but alas, it wasn't to be. But F355 actually arrived after the launch of PlayStation 2 in Japan, and it's games like this that actually left folks wondering, is the PS2 really all it's cracked up to be? After all, earlier that year, just after launch, Square's very first PlayStation 2 game was released, known as Driving Emotion Type S. And this one is interesting. On the surface, it has some cool things going for it. It runs at 60 frames per second, features nifty post-processing effects including depth of field, and takes advantage of higher color depth options on PS2, enabling some very smooth color gradients and blending effects. Also, for a game of this vintage, the cockpit view is decidedly very impressive, and not something we regularly saw in racing games at the time. And of course, the game has this wonderful Y2K aesthetic with bright lights and a wonderful soundtrack to boot. Unfortunately, it also falls victim to an issue that plagued many first-generation games in the system: the jaggies. It uses the system's field rendering mode, but without any sort of flicker filter or any other technique that was later used to improve image quality on the system, and it winds up looking extra raw and jagged as a result. The car models, while not bad, also didn't feel like a massive step up from games on Dreamcast. But there's more to this than just the visuals. When this game was first released in Japan, it was widely criticized for its driving model, so the original developer went back in to sort of tweak the game for release in the West. And when you first pick up the game, it's rather difficult to play. But then I received a message from someone who has pretty good tastes in driving games, suggesting that I give it another shot. He had written an article on this very subject, and after reading it, I was determined to give the game another shot. Turns out the main issue comes down to the way the analog stick maps to the steering wheel. Typically, when playing a racing game with an analog stick, if you oversteer into a corner, for instance, your first reaction is to press the opposite direction on the stick. Such an extreme movement is not something you'd actually do when driving a real car though. And this game is sort of built around that notion. So rather than pressing the opposite direction, it basically wants you to center the stick instead. Once you wrap your mind around this weird control scheme though, you can actually start having some fun, but it's still pretty tough. But if you look back at opinions from that era, it's clear that whether talking about handling or the visuals themselves, this game definitely had a somewhat negative impact on the perception of PlayStation 2 at the time. But here's the thing, Gran Turismo itself actually kind of played a part in this perception as well, and that actually comes down to one thing: Gran Turismo 2000. Yep, released to the public as a playable demo at the Spring 2000 TGS, GT2000 screenshots and videos were everywhere at this time, and it wasn't necessarily for the best. So what do I mean? Well, okay, so this demo basically includes one track, the Seattle circuit, though the special stage Route 5 data does seem to be on the disc, though not usable. This demo lets players take a couple laps around the track and was basically designed to showcase what's possible on PlayStation 2. Problem is, the demo has pretty serious limitations. It uses a low-resolution field-rendered mode, so it's effectively just 224 pixels of vertical resolution per frame. The background assets are still lacking a lot of detail, with low-resolution textures and poorly filtered foliage all over the place. Cars are certainly pretty detailed, but unlike GT3 itself, they feature opaque windows and somewhat garish shading. We'll actually get into some of these comparisons during the next section, by the way. Furthermore, it feels like it's running on the Gran Turismo 2 engine, at least in terms of overall vehicle handling. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it demonstrates how early this version really is. What makes all this worse though is that at the time, outlets weren't really equipped to deal with capturing field-rendered graphics like GT2000, and the resulting screenshots that spread around the internet were, by and large, absolutely dreadful. Yes, the console wars were still in full effect even during this era, and people were all too happy to use the worst possible screenshots of GT2000 with just half the rendered pixels being displayed. This helped demonstrate that perhaps PlayStation 2 was not as powerful as it had been claimed. But it did hint at a few cool things. For one, it ran at 60 frames per second, which is nice, but it also featured an impressive use of depth of field and heat haze, unlike anything else we'd seen at the time. So it did suggest that PS2 had a few tricks up its sleeve, but unfortunately, it fell short. So while GT2000 succeeded in hyping people up for a next-generation GT game, I also believe it contributed to the negativity around the pre-launch period of PlayStation 2 in North America. Not that it actually had any real impact on its success, mind you. So while screenshots and real player videos of Gran Turismo 2000 filled screens around the world, Polyphony Digital continued to work on the actual next game. Over the next year, racing games continued to arrive. Metropolis Street Racer, for instance, was a huge release on Dreamcast when it finally showed up, serving as the predecessor to the PGR games. The game itself is absolutely brilliant, but I will say that the visuals have aged more than I had expected, specifically when it comes to rendering cars. Tokyo Extreme Racer also received a sequel on the Dreamcast, and this one looks significantly better than the first entry, with more detailed vehicles, better reflections, and even better environments. I love these games, I really wish it would make a comeback. Fall 2000 also saw the release of perhaps the most visually striking Dreamcast racing game, Test Drive Le Mans, from Melbourne House. This one puts a huge number of cars on screen, uses higher quality texture filtering than any other Dreamcast game, and features a surprising amount of detail. It was a noticeable step up from pretty much every other racing game that had released on the platform. The only downside here is that it's limited to just 30 frames per second. Of course, this actually received a PlayStation 2 port as well, which is interesting. Heck, the same is true of AM2's F355 Challenge. It would also receive a port to the PS2 later in its life. But in late 2000, we were living in blissful ignorance regarding the state of the Dreamcast. I actually really like this comparison, as F355 Challenge was definitely one of the best looking games in Dreamcast, I feel. And the PlayStation 2 port, while pretty good actually, is lacking in certain details. The texture quality, for instance, takes a hit, which was exactly in line with the conversations happening around the system back in 2000. So going into 2001, the Dreamcast had amassed a decent library of racing games, and the PlayStation 2 had launched in North America. The thing is, it turns out this demo of GT2000 would actually have the inverse effect of what we've seen in newer games like Watch Dogs from 2013, with its unrealistic trailer shown pre-release. Gran Turismo 2000 as a product was not to be in the end, and it was instead announced that Polyphony's next game would be titled Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec. Just 1 year after this demo then, on April 28th, Gran Turismo 3 arrived on PlayStation 2 in Japan, and along with it, one of the greatest generational leaps in the history of video games. Throughout the history of console gaming, there are precious few games which genuinely feel like a shift in the state of the art. Games that represent a true next-generation leap. Super Mario 64 is certainly one of these games. Metal Gear Solid 2, which actually came after GT3, is as well. Gran Turismo 3 itself? Yeah, it belongs to this elite group, representing, as I suggested earlier, one of the single most impressive leaps in visual fidelity in the history of the medium. When people talk about expectations for next-generation visuals, Gran Turismo 3 is the type of leap they might be thinking of. It's that good. Compared to Gran Turismo 2000, Polyphony made some huge improvements. The resolution was boosted by 50% for starters. It's still interlaced in its output, but internally it now uses a full-frame buffer, so it's much cleaner, especially on a CRT. It also supports widescreen now. Note the massive increase in overall geometric detail. The underpass is just a flat texture in GT2000, but much more detailed in GT3. Same goes for everything else in the city really. They added more model detail and boosted texture quality significantly, in addition to enhancing the lighting in general. Just look at the buildings here in GT2000 versus 3. You might also notice that the windows are no longer opaque as they were in GT2000, and reflections are now of a higher quality, something we'll talk about shortly. As a quick aside, I actually ripped some of the textures out of GT3 and GT2000 and was surprised at the difference. In GT2000, a lot of the building textures are limited to just 64 pixels by 64 pixels, whereas in the final game, these textures are increased to 128 by 128, so basically 4 times the resolution. The point is, the leap in fidelity between the older demo and the final game is something I feel deserves a lot of credit. We've become accustomed to games overreaching visual targets in their pre-release state, but there are certainly times when the opposite can occur as well. There's no doubt, however, that Gran Turismo 3 is one of the first big blockbuster releases for the PlayStation 2. Its release kicked off one of the best seasons for gaming in the history of the medium, really. The months that would follow GT3 were absolutely jam-packed with goodness. So what do you get with Gran Turismo 3 then? Well, the core concepts remain intact, but the shift to next generation hardware did indeed have an impact on the amount of content available in total. Basically, after GT2's huge number of cars, GT3 scales this back to around 185. Now, 185 cars is still a lot when you consider the boost in detail made possible on PlayStation 2, but it definitely changed the flow of the game. The cars in GT3 feature more than 20 to 30 times the amount of geometric detail compared to the original PlayStation, plus a more robust physics and handling simulation in addition to improved AI. Gran Turismo 3 also contains fewer tracks than the second game, 19 in GT3 versus GT2's 27, though both are ahead of that original Gran Turismo. When you compare the quality of what's being displayed, however, the leap in fidelity is absolutely mind-blowing in retrospect. GT3 offers more than double the frame rate, at a much higher resolution, with loads of extra detail and lighting. It was, in my opinion, the best looking racing game ever made as of summer 2001. Moreover, I think this represents the largest single leap in visual fidelity between console generations of all time. We've never seen anything like this before or since. Later on in this segment though, we will compare with some other racing games from this era so we can see how it stacks up against those. The core of the experience then, the simulation mode, is fully intact with a huge variety of races and events to enjoy. Compared to the second game, I found the progression to be a little on the slow side. It can take a long time to earn credits or new cars, but it still retains that thrill of tuning and winning races. The new menu system though is dramatically better than Gran Turismo 2. It's much faster and makes it much easier to move between the various screens, so that part of the career is greatly improved over PlayStation. The menus are all presented in high resolution and look super sharp, but it's the way they move that perhaps surprised me the most back in the day, especially in the arcade mode. You navigate between the various screens and are presented with these gorgeous 60 frames per second videos highlighting your selection. It's extremely polished, and I think that this is key as many other games from this era, especially from the West, tended to fall short in this regard, with sluggish, often ugly menu systems. Then you have the gorgeous car selection screen, which really highlights the new level of detail made possible on PlayStation 2, and I also love that depth of field effect. For 2001 though, these were simply the best looking virtual cars in the market. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the features then, because you might be wondering what separates Gran Turismo 3 from the pack. I mean, in terms of raw polygon counts, it's actually not that far away from other games of this era. I mean, Test Drive Le Mans holds up against it very well, right? No, this is more about what they do with those resources. So firstly, the cars. One of the key features presented in GT3 are the reflections across the surface of each car. We take this for granted now, but as of 2001, most games simply didn't have reflections that matched the surroundings. Prior to this, the solution to this problem usually involved using a texture that roughly matched the surroundings, blended with the vehicle's diffuse layer. As noted earlier, Gran Turismo and Gran Turismo 2 use this sort of trick to simulate reflections, but the texture itself never actually changes during the race. You can more easily see something like this in Tokyo Extreme Racer on the Dreamcast. In Ridge Racer 5, Namco improved this by using different textures depending on whether you're inside a tunnel or outdoors in the city, while also scrolling the texture to simulate movement. Tokyo Extreme Racer 2 also uses this trick. It still uses a texture like the first game, but this time it scrolls, with the scenery greatly enhancing the sense of motion. With GT3, however, you could now drive beneath trees, next to any road surface or object, and beneath banners above the road, and they all appear in the paintwork. But was it the first game to do this? Well, not necessarily. It's tough to say for sure, but the earliest example that I found appears in Taito's Ray Tracers on the original PlayStation. Check out that rear window. It's pretty impressive, right? It also appears in another Genki developed game, Rally Challenge 2000 for N64. Check out these reflections, they actually line up perfectly with the environment. In comparison, Gran Turismo 3 does more with this effect, but it's extremely cool to see something like this on N64, I think. How does it work in GT3 then? So firstly, the reflection itself is generated using what amounts to a reflection capture probe. It's almost like what we use in modern games, but of course they had to be more selective with their usage given the memory constraints of the time. The PS2 does not natively support cube maps either, so Polyphony uses a spherical map instead, another method for environmental texturing like this. Of course, this didn't stop developers from trying, and Renderware would actually end up supporting cube maps on PlayStation 2. Burnout 3 and Burnout Revenge both use them, for instance. Now, as you drive around the track, the reflection texture on the car is updated every single frame, and this texture is used as the source for drawing the reflection across the body of the car. But it's not just the reflection itself that matters here. Polyphony also developed a rudimentary roughness cutoff simulation designed to vary the appearance of those reflections based on the varying surface properties of each car. You know, the difference between glass, plastic, and metal. It's actually represented here. This is where GT3 pulls away from something like Rally Challenge 2000 then, which only really features it on the glass. These two features specifically explain why GT3 looks so impressive at the time. No other racing game had ever attempted something quite like this. There's more, however. Let's talk about the road surface. In any modern driving game, the interaction of light across a road surface is basically a given. Driving in the sun? Yeah, you're gonna get a nice specular highlight on the road. In 2001 though, prior to the launch of hardware capable of pixel shading, this really wasn't a thing that you saw much, but Polyphony Digital sure tried their best to simulate this effect. So check it out. Driving around the Seattle stage, note how the glint of the sun plays off the road surface when the sun is in line with the player position. Basically doing vertex shading with one light dedicated specifically to the stage's specular component. It's not a per pixel operation, but I think it works. Even more impressive are these wet tracks. At the time, this was just an unbelievable thing to see, but how does it actually work? Well, there's two tricks here. Firstly, as was common at the time, the trackside geometry is mirrored and simplified beneath the road surface itself. We saw this in Metal Gear Solid 2 as well, basically drawing simplified geometry beneath the road surface. But what about dynamic objects? Well, here Polyphony uses a render-to-texture feature to capture the cars, as well as other moving objects, while the lights are represented using textures created to resemble long streaks of light on the road surface. Beyond this, due to the nature of the game running at a lower resolution without bitmaps, the surface itself takes on a shimmery appearance in motion, which, when combined with the reflection, sort of creates this perception of a wet surface. It's this combination of all these tricks together that creates the intended effect. They did a lot with the sunlight as well. The sun itself is a simple transparent texture, but it's used to give the impression of light streaming from the source due to how it's blended and placed here. When driving through certain areas of the track, you also see these faked light shafts used to create sort of a volumetric effect, but it's really just a transparent texture. Then there's the light or lens flares that appear throughout the game. You'll notice these on car head and tail lights as well as street lamps. So you remember the Bleemcast comparison when I commented on the light halos in GT2, right? Up to this point, when you wanted to achieve this effect, whether on PC or console, you typically did so using a texture. In fact, that's how it worked in 1998's Unreal as well. The calculations to make it work also happened on the CPU side. On PlayStation 2, however, the graphics synthesizer can accomplish this objective in hardware. These flares are basically assigned to screen position of each light source, but the fading in and out of the flare is determined by calculating the percentage visibility of the point as an alpha blend value and then using that data to create the effect. But more interestingly, all these lens flares are actually polygonal meshes. The reason for this is simple. During replays specifically, the camera often zooms in on the cars, but the artists wanted to retain those super sharp lens flares. If you zoomed in on a texture, it was likely to break down and appear blurry. Thus, you'd need to use a super high-res asset to avoid a loss in detail, which costs too much memory, especially for PlayStation 2. By using a polygonal mesh then, you can get away with much smaller textures on that particular object, so you don't blow your memory budget, and it looks awesome in action. They used meshes for a lot of things like this, including the speedometer needles, which are also rendered as polygons. Or how about the heat haze, another neat post-processing trick that was brought into the mix by Polyphony Digital. In fact, there's a famous quote of Yamauchi himself lamenting the fact that they couldn't pull this off in HD on PlayStation 3 the following generation. And that's ultimately the key here. Gran Turismo 3 leans heavily on artist-driven techniques like this, combined with the unique hardware of PlayStation 2. It wasn't possible to simulate the natural phenomenon itself, as is possible in modern game engines, so the team found ways to replicate realistic details like this within the limitations of the hardware. Moreover, Gran Turismo 3 is known for its unwavering dedication to 60 frames per second. I was never able to drop the frame rate even once. It's as perfect a frame rate as anyone could ask for, and this is true in both gameplay and replays. The thing is, looking at interlaced capture on an LCD screen, as we're seeing in this video, doesn't really do it justice. You've got to see the game running on a CRT to really appreciate it, I feel. To fully understand the impact though, let's briefly look back at some of the racing games we previously discussed. I think this is kind of fun. So firstly, there's Sega GT on Dreamcast. This is a really interesting comparison because on the surface, Sega GT actually holds up better than you might expect, thanks partly to Dreamcast's pristine video output. But I still think Polyphony Digital's work here has quite the edge. Lighting is key. Sega GT is flat, lacking any of the nuance seen in GT3, from the lack of reflection textures on the car, the exaggerated lens flares in the night stage, or the lack of specular highlights. These are all areas where Polyphony Digital really tried to push things forward. Sega GT is an interesting case though, as it does do plenty of things right on its own, but the flat shading, lower frame rate, and unimpressive car models kinda let it down. They would revisit this though on another console. I also want to compare against Test Drive Le Mans and F355 Challenge. GT3 doesn't share any of these tracks though, but I still want to talk about Le Mans because I think this one actually compares favorably with detailed tracks and cars plus some excellent lighting and even these beautiful volume shadows. In fact, in some ways, it's more impressive than Gran Turismo 3. It's really only let down by the lower overall frame rate and lower quality vehicle shading. But despite this, I think it stands out as one of the most impressive games on Dreamcast. F355 Challenge 2 is an interesting one as it does run at 60 FPS with pristine image quality. It's lacking the reflections and lighting of GT3 of course, but I still think it compares pretty well. What about Driving Emotion Type S? Well, there's also a massive bump in fidelity over this one, and I think a lot of it comes down to the way, again, lighting and reflections are handled. That said, I have to give credit to Driving Emotion Type S's cockpit view, which is really nice. Full 3D rendered cockpit views like this were extremely uncommon in console games as of 2001. Obviously, implementing this in Gran Turismo 3 would have been a lot more work owing to the huge number of cars, but still, it's a difference worth mentioning. We'll have more comparisons to other games coming up in our next section, but I feel for now, this is why Gran Turismo 3 managed to look more realistic to the eye when it launched. Nobody else was doing anything quite like it. But there's more. GT3 is also the first in the series to support full force feedback racing wheels. This was something previously limited to the domain of PC racers, but now it was an option on consoles as well. It's something that would become crucial to these types of games in the future. Of course, GT3 doesn't support the full 900 degrees of rotation which would arrive in GT4, but it's still very effective and a lot of fun. Even better, GT3 supports iLink connections to allow multiple PlayStation 2 systems to talk to one another. This is basically a FireWire cable, by the way. This could be used for up to 6-player multiplayer, which is neat, but honestly, the real draw for me is the option to play the game with 3 displays at once. That's right, you could use 3 PlayStation 2s to widen your view of the action. Combining a force feedback wheel with 3 PlayStation 2s enabled like this, it allowed quite an immersive experience for 2001. If you had the cash, of course. Unfortunately, later PS2s removed the FireWire port, so I wasn't able to recreate this myself, even though I do have enough CRTs to pull it off. I want to briefly touch on the audio again here. GT3 is the last in the series which would feature a completely different soundtrack in each region. There would still be differences going forward, of course, but in this case, every track is replaced. Let's look at the intro for comparison then, as we've done with the last 2 games. Once again, the Japanese version gets a wonderful rendition of Moon Over the Castle. In the US, however, a remix of Lenny Kravitz's Are You Gonna Go My Way is used, and while I do enjoy this track, it never quite matched the tone I associate with Gran Turismo. Europe then uses Just a Day by Feeder, which again, I feel like this somehow feels weird to me. Sony sure did love Feeder though, what's up with that? So yeah, hopefully you can understand the impact of Gran Turismo 3 when it arrived in 2001, but Polyphony wasn't finished with that game just yet. You see, in 2002 the studio released 3 more reduced scale versions of Gran Turismo 3, known as Gran Turismo Concept. These are basically cut down versions of GT3 focused on concept cars being shown off at various auto trade shows in 2002. The first release, 2001 Tokyo, features the Nissan GTR 2001 concept car, along with a total of 51 vehicles. It also features a new introduction movie, new menus, and its own pseudo-progression system. In May of 2002 then, they released 2002 Tokyo Soul, which introduced cars from Hyundai to the series for the very first time. This one coincided with new models revealed at the Seoul Motor Show and launched around the time of PlayStation 2 in Korea. Lastly, the final release was known as 2002 Tokyo Geneva, which basically includes all content from prior concept discs but adds a few new models to the mix. None of the concept games saw release in North America, but they are interesting relics of this era that show Polyphony Digital trying to become more involved with the auto manufacturers themselves, almost like a prelude to the eventual Vision Gran Turismo project. Ultimately, it's tough to convey the sheer impact of Gran Turismo 3 at time of release. This is a game which I feel helped start the system's legacy after a slightly rocky start. It looked incredible and offered the depth that Gran Turismo had become known for. PlayStation 2 is the platform where Polyphony Digital could truly shine, and things would only get better from here. Fall 2001, Microsoft and Nintendo arrive with their first and latest consoles, respectively. The original Xbox from Microsoft and the Nintendo GameCube. These two machines boasted enhanced capabilities over PlayStation 2, with Xbox actually standing as the first console to support fully programmable shaders. Yet during this era, I'd argue that each platform had something truly special to offer. You really wanted to own them all. Of course, by this point, the influence of Gran Turismo was keenly felt across the industry, with a sharp rise in the number of realistic, licensed, car-based racing games. This generation is so packed with racing games that you almost need to break them down into subcategories. Some of these categories include arcade-style racing games like Ridge Racer 5 or Burnout, simulation-style games with real-world cars such as Gran Turismo, Sega GT 2002, and Enthusia, dedicated rally games like Rally Sport or Shocks, games based on real motorsports such as F1, and even stuff like Need for Speed Underground, which taps into that mix of realism and arcade racing. That's not even getting into things like kart racers. Honestly, there's just so many games here, there's no way I could possibly discuss them all in this video, even though I would love to. But I do think they're very important when it comes to context. Thus, I'd like to take you on a little tour of this period of racing game history. Let's begin with one of my favorites, Project Gotham Racing for Xbox. While Halo was the title to buy on the Xbox at launch, PGR stands as my second favorite of the bunch. This is basically the perfect follow-up to Metropolis Street Racer on Dreamcast, but with vastly improved visuals. You still have the Cone Gate challenges to enjoy, where you earn kudos for drifting and various other things like that, as well as actual races, where you drive alongside numerous licensed cars and other interesting events as well. It features 4 cities with multiple layouts to enjoy, as well as a cool radio station-like presentation, much like MSR. This game really showcases the Xbox prowess though, with beautifully rendered city environments running at a smooth 60 frames per second. Cars and lighting were a gigantic step up from MSR. The only real visual caveat here is that the cube maps used for reflection textures update at a low rate, so reflections appear less smooth than you'd hope. But overall, this is one gorgeous game that stands up favorably against Gran Turismo 3, which had released earlier that year. PGR would receive a direct sequel though on the original Xbox, PGR 2, which is even better gameplay-wise in some aspects, but alas, it's dropped to 30 frames per second. On the plus side, it does utilize actual anti-aliasing, so image quality is a step above pretty much all other games during this era, I'd say. We'll revisit this later though, because it's going to take part in an amazing upcoming showdown. Next up, I mentioned Sega GT for Dreamcast earlier, but Sega actually followed this up with Sega GT 2002 on the Xbox. This one demonstrates that the team learned a lot from that original project, and 2002 is overall a huge improvement. It plays better than the original while offering a unique career mode, plus it looks dramatically nicer too, with an awesome vibe that can only be described as pure sunset. Clearly, the more advanced hardware of Xbox allowed them to push the visuals forward, including this gorgeous depth of field effect used during replays, but it also allows for a mostly smooth 60 frames per second frame rate wise. Unfortunately, as with Project Gotham, the reflection maps update at a low rate again, so they don't look all that smooth. Overall though, I think GT 2002 is moderately comparable with Gran Turismo 3 itself, and absolutely worth checking out to better understand Sega's history during this era. It also received an online-specific follow-up in 2003, but unfortunately, I don't own that one, so I can't really show it here. But our next one is a little different.
Ain't nothing like a funky beat.
That same year, Capcom also took a shot at the realistic driving game with Auto Modelista, except it's only realistic in concept, as the art team went for a completely different look. It's cel-shaded. And you know what? It still looks amazing. The use of exaggerated speed lines and beautifully crafted textures make for a super unique looking game that is still as beautiful today as it ever was. There's some other neat visual flourishes here as well, such as the shadows from trees when you drive under them. It's not actually a projected shadow per se, it's just a texture, but it's pretty effective. It really is a beautiful game. This one is weird though, because when bringing it to the West, Capcom made changes to the driving model and it winds up feeling like a completely different game. The issue here is that the game was always lacking in challenge, but instead of trying to refine the AI or address it in other areas, they simply made the cars somewhat heavier and more difficult to control. At least that's how it feels to me. So while this version did receive some additional American-made cars and 2 new oval tracks, I actually prefer how the Japanese version plays. It's really a shame Capcom didn't do more with this concept though, as it's such a beautiful game. And how about comparisons with Gran Turismo 3? This one's interesting because typically you hear people suggest that more realistic games age worse than cartoony games. And yeah, Auto Modelista has indeed aged beautifully, but honestly, so has Gran Turismo 3. And despite the fact that it also aims for realism, I think it has strong art direction to back it up. It's possible to deliver a realistic looking game that still maintains a sense of style. Curiously, this game received a spiritual follow-up in the form of Group S Challenge, or Circus Drive as it's known in Japan, for the Xbox. This one goes for a more realistic style, however, so it never really received the attention of Auto Modelista. In fact, it would actually end Capcom's attempts at creating driving games entirely. Technically, there are some interesting things here though. The game actually seems to use shadow maps, which is really unusual for the era, lending the environment some additional depth. The car models are also solid, and it targets 60 frames per second, though suffers from plenty of screen tearing in busy scenes. Again, with the track selection, we can't necessarily do a direct comparison with GT3, but we can still do this. Both games feature a sunset orange urban track. Capcom did a pretty good job here overall, but I still think GT3 takes the crown when it comes to overall art direction. But Capcom was tapping into the Xbox's graphics chip to pull off some tricks that you don't see in GT3. Another neat feature is this though. It uses this bizarre camera option which lets you drive in first person while a small picture-in-picture window shows your car from replay camera angles. Neat. Speaking of shadows, how many of you are familiar with this game? Check out the shadows from this fence projecting across the vehicle. That looks pretty good, right? What platform do you think this is for? While surprising as it may seem, this is a PlayStation 2 game. First released as Axle Impact in Korea and later as DT Racer in the West, you'd be forgiven for missing out on this one given its budget price tag and lack of publicity. In reality though, it's kind of a technical showpiece for PlayStation 2. It features full shadows that are dynamically projected across moving cars, beautiful specular highlight tricks on the road surface, convincing motion blur effects around the edge of the camera, and some beautifully detailed cars and tracks. It also supports 16:9 and 480p. Unfortunately, the downside here is that it's only 30 frames per second, and the rigid body physics model can definitely drop that frame rate even lower. Weirdly enough, the game also features a soundtrack by DJ Tiesto. So if you're looking for some of that smooth, early 2000s trance music, DT Racer has you covered. For those that were around during the original Gaming Age forum days though, you might remember this one as Faf Racer. Yes, it's real, and boy, it's pretty impressive. Check it out. Xbox also received a slew of other games worth mentioning. Apex or Racing Evoluzione, for instance. The main innovation here centers on building up your own garage and crafting your dream car to win races. However, it's not all fiction. Apex features a wide range of licensed cars too. I wanted to mention this one specifically as it stands out as one of the more technically ambitious racers of the era. It features these remarkably detailed tracks with rich texturing, decent vehicle models, and some amazing lighting and reflections. They also use this clever texture layering trick to give the impression of motion blur. It's not actually motion blur, as it only applies to the tarmac, but they basically fade this in on the road surface texture to give it a speed layer, if you will. It increases the sense of momentum. Unfortunately, it's limited to 30 frames per second and the handling is a little bit twitchy. It also features one of the strangest camera angle options I've ever seen. I call this the cube map appreciation view. The camera is basically placed directly above your vehicle, like a Google Street View car, I suppose, making it tough to drive, but giving you this detailed look at the reflections across the surface. Still, it's a cool game and I recommend checking it out. It's even compatible with Xbox 360. Meanwhile, Namco tossed its hat into the ring with R Racing Evolution. This one stings a little because we never got a proper follow-up to Ridge Racer 5 on the PlayStation 2. And it's fair to say that the success of Gran Turismo is likely why. Namco did have some previous experience with more sim-like games such as the MotoGP titles, but still. This one is somewhat unique, however, as the main mode is designed as a story-driven experience. There's cutscenes and all sorts of events tied directly into this. There's a good selection of tracks here, and I have to say the rendering quality of these environments is actually quite good. It runs at a full 60 frames per second as well, as you might expect from Namco of this era. The one major nitpick I have here stems from the third-person camera. Essentially, it's far too stiff, connected very directly to the car itself, so it never feels great to drive using this view. Compared to the Gran Turismo games, it's also lacking in terms of the overall car shading, but the environments hold up remarkably well. This is one of the few games on this list that was released across basically every platform at the time, so it has PS2, GameCube, and Xbox versions available. Also, the GameCube version comes in a 2-disc set including Pac-Man Versus, which is a really nice bonus. The Rally Sport Challenge games also deserve a mention here, bringing one of the best looking and playing rally experiences to the Xbox. It is in many ways the spiritual successor to the Sega Rally games, and it's incredible. The quality of the models, environments, trees especially, and the lighting are all top tier. We're looking at Rally Sport Challenge 2 here, by the way. The original is great too, but I love Rally Sport Challenge 2. This game has such a wide range of environments to race on. It has hill climbs, it has closed circuits, it has normal rally, it has tracks with different weather conditions, it has physics on objects such as grass that you can run over, and objects scattered along the side of the track also have rigid body physics applied to them. It also has a nice selection of camera views, including a hood cam and a pseudo cockpit view with sort of a black silhouette representing the cockpit itself. In addition, the game has full damage modeling, so as you crash and bump into other racers, your car actually takes damage. It even runs at 60 frames per second, unlike many other racers on Xbox, and in 480p. It holds up so well today. I love this game. Speaking of rally, PS2 received a killer rally game by the name of Shocks, or Rally Shocks in Japan, that also feels like a nod to classic Sega Rally titles. As with most of the games on this list, this game also has licensed vehicles. It is a little more arcadey, however, with these Shocks zones, as they're called, where essentially when you hit one of these points, you want to drift and do crazy stuff to increase your rank, basically. It fits in nicely with the other EA Sports big games of this era, like SSX. I genuinely miss these types of games from EA. I really wish they'd bring this stuff back. Okay, there's 3 more games I want to mention before we arrive at the next Gran Turismo, starting with Grand Prix Challenge from Melbourne House. Yes, the same developer behind the earlier Le Mans 24 Hours, or Test Drive Le Mans. And this one really shows what they can do on the PlayStation 2. Firstly, it still features a huge grid of cars, but this time the level of detail and quality of the lighting and shading has been amped up significantly since Le Mans. Furthermore, it now runs at 60 frames per second and seems to be basically 100% locked. The quality of the environment rendering is top tier, and it has some of the best camera work I've seen in a game like this. The behind the driver viewpoint camera is fantastic. I'm not one to typically play these sort of F1 style games, and my knowledge on F1 is relatively limited, I have to admit. But the speed of the game and the quality of the visuals on display really showcase what Melbourne House could do. Sadly, after the release of this game, they would only have 4 more titles before the studio was shuttered. Next up, earlier I mentioned Need for Speed Underground, and I want to quickly highlight this one because there is some very impressive technology on display here. Firstly, the developers wanted to achieve this sort of fast and furious look by focusing heavily on post-processing effects, and as a result, the PS2 version specifically includes some very fancy motion blur techniques which still look amazing today. I'm really not entirely sure how they pulled this off. Beyond that, the game uses these planar reflections, giving the roads this beautiful wet surface effect. The car models are great with nice reflections, and everything just looks really slick. The only downside to this one is that the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second, and even then it can drop below that point. This game was extremely important for EA and stands as one of the best Need for Speed games ever made. The amount of customization on offer here, the awesome soundtrack, and just the sheer volume of events available, it's a fantastic title. And while I understand that Need for Speed Underground 2 is perhaps even more popular, I much prefer the track-based design of Underground 1. Of course, if you permit me to jump ahead chronologically for a moment, there's one other game we need to mention here.
Tjena på! Det här är Sven Retro 2000 och det här är Volvo Drive for Life. Ett exklusivt Xbox racingspel som är utvecklad av den brittiska studion Climax. Det här spelet var utformat för att ge Xbox-spelare en chans att uppleva nya bilar från Volvos utbud i 2005. Den gavs bort hos 8 försäljare i USA och innehåller 3 bilar. Volvo S40, S60R och XC90 V8. När du först väljer en bil får du chansen att ta ut en Volvo på en testbana där du kan uppleva den prisbelönte säkerhets- och prestationsproblemfrågorna som om när du försöker att undvika att köra in en älg eller ta dig förbi kögullgrindarna. Men sedan börjar det roliga. Välj till exempel S40 och ditt mål är enkelt. Spela vad som i princip är en runda outrun och ta dig fram till Volvo-handlaren i slutet. Men Sven, jag vill köra SUV säger du. Inga problem min vän. Då gör du samma sak, men på isiga vägar när du tar dig till Volvo-hotellet. Med S60R får du delta i en tävling med alla Volvo-bilar. En riktig svensk triumf som man säger. Du kan också luta dig tillbaka och njuta av crash-testvideor eller lära dig mer om Volvo med den smidiga svenska värld Hans Nilsson. En man så äkta svenska som kavli kaviar. Inget annat spel i den här videon kommer i närheten att simulera nöjet att köra en Volvo som det här spelet, vilket gör det till ett riktigt must have. Jag ger det här spelet 4,5 Gunda Svan. Spela det här spelet. Spela den till ära för alla svenska maniacs där ute, men viktigast av allt, spela det här för Hans Nilsson.
So yeah, all this stuff and more was happening between the release of Gran Turismo 3 and Gran Turismo 4. It's really just the tip of the iceberg too. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about Forza Motorsport or Konami's Enthusia either. Those arrived in 2005. We'll talk about them then. So, Gran Turismo 4. Where do we even start? Well, we received our first taste of GT4 with the release of the Prologue disc in late 2003. This basically set the stage for the final game, which was originally due in 2003. Instead, it was delayed by quite a while, first arriving in Japan in December of 2004. Gran Turismo 4 is perhaps the largest, most jam-packed entry in the entire series. It's built on the foundation of Gran Turismo 3's engine, but ramped up significantly in key areas. It features over 700 cars this time, which is simply absurd when considering the quality of the models. Even crazier, this game has 51 tracks spread across real circuits, fictional circuits, city environments, and rally tracks. There's just so much content here, really. As before, the GT or simulation mode returns, but it introduces this new menu system which has so many events and features to explore as you scroll around the map. It's clear the developers wanted to pour everything they had into making this game. You still have the license tests, the car dealers to visit, the Sunday Cups to race, and the like, but now you're introduced to new, unique events such as drag racing, both dirt and snow rally, full 24-hour endurance challenges, special cups focused on manufacturers, and all sorts of other weird trials. Beyond that, this entry also introduces the B-Spec mode, which basically amounts to watching a virtual driver tackle races while you kind of encourage them, so to speak. The arcade mode is also much more fleshed out this time, and all the other major features from GT3 return. On top of this, GT4 marks the introduction of photo mode for the series. In fact, it's one of the earliest games I can think of which has this as an option. You can snap an in-game photo, and then the console can render it out at a higher resolution, which you can then save to a USB stick. The handling itself also received a major overhaul, with car dynamics and body movement now becoming much more realistic, though it's not necessarily what everyone wanted as it shifted towards increased realism over pick-up-and-play fun. For instance, you couldn't easily ride the walls anymore due to the increased friction, so it was more difficult to cheese the game if you're that kind of racer. So yeah, it's more Gran Turismo than you would ever possibly know what to do with. Just an absurdly large game by any metric. But what I really want to talk about here are the technical changes. Gran Turismo 4 offers a slew of enhancements over GT3, including higher resolution output support, including a 1080i HD mode, driver animations for open cockpit vehicles, 3D crowds that react to your driving, and larger, more detailed environments with improved textures and lighting. So let's start with the resolution question then. While GT3 seemingly used a 448 line mode for much of its drawing, it's still ultimately an interlaced game at heart, but GT4 actually offers players a choice. You can now run in 480p progressive scan mode, or opt for a 1080i mode. Unfortunately, these two modes were removed in the PAL version of the game for some reason. Now, by default, the game runs in an interlaced mode using 24-bit color like GT3. The 480p mode, though, switches to a 640 by 448 progressive scan frame buffer, but reduces color depth to 16-bit due to memory constraints. This results in an image with more visible dithering patterns and some additional color banding as well. It's an interesting trade-off though, because 480p is noticeably sharper on a monitor supporting this option, but I also tend to prefer the interlaced output on a nice professional CRT due to how it blends the fields. Still, 480p was a fantastic option that brings the image quality in line with Xbox and GameCube titles. GameCube especially, as that also typically ran games in 16-bit color mode with obvious dithering when using 480p output. But what about the 1080i mode? This one is extra strange, and no, it's nowhere near the actual 1080i resolution. Instead, it basically runs at 576 by 480 per frame, but thanks to interlacing, we actually get an effective 576 by 960 instead. So it increases the perception of vertical resolution, but slightly decreases the horizontal res. The resulting image then within the 1080i frame is roughly 1728 by 960, with 576 being multiplied and scaled by 3 to 1728, and 480 being doubled due to the interlacing. Also worth noting that 1080i only displays in widescreen mode. It is an inherently widescreen resolution after all. You can do this with 480i and 480p as well, but that's anamorphic and it stretches the pixels. So depending on how your display or scaler does that, the 1080i version can actually look a little bit sharper in widescreen mode. As you can see in the capture, it also uses 16-bit color like the 480p mode. As a result, I wouldn't really call this an HD mode per se, but at the same time, I do think context is key here. On HD capable CRTs of this era, few could actually resolve the full 1080i signal, so GT4's 1080i mode winds up looking really sharp and nice, making it a good choice for widescreen on an HD capable CRT of the era. The other thing to note is that running in 1080i or 480p can introduce some screen tearing during replays, when the screen is packed at least, something I didn't really notice in the 480i mode. So that's basically the score with this resolution stuff, and hopefully it helps clear up this option and why Polyphony Digital included it. I think it's a neat inclusion, and it's one of the only games in the system to actually output 1080i. Beyond this, however, other improvements were made with higher quality depth of field effects, a rudimentary simulation of Fresnel on car paint, and higher quality specular work, plus some of the backgrounds are just gorgeous. I love the Grand Canyon stage. Unfortunately, the chase cam was, I feel, somewhat compromised in GT4 with an overly restrictive, tight focus on the car. Just recently, however, Cookie PL Monster, who I mentioned in the GT2 section, actually discovered how to enable the GT3 style chase cam in this game, so there is finally a solution, check his stuff out. Still, you can really see that Polyphony was pushing the PlayStation 2 to its limits, and the result is a beautiful game all around. Alongside all of the content packed into GT4, however, one of the new tracks sticks out, specifically the Nürburgring. This famous 20-kilometer German racetrack has become prolific in many racing games today, and a lot of this really kicked off during this specific era. That is to say, Nürburgring is included in several key games from this period, and I feel this track actually makes for an interesting point of comparison. So, get ready for the ringside showdown as we pit Gran Turismo 4's version of the Nürburgring against 3 other games. Let's take a tour of our contestants. First up, PGR2. Released more than a year prior to GT4 itself, PGR2 makes the list due to its high quality visuals and popularity at the time. But this one is interesting because most of the game actually focuses on city-based environments. So how does it fare when rendering a racetrack like this? The next game on the list then, Enthusia, Professional Racing from Konami. This game released in 2005 after GT4, and it's a key release as it's one of the few Japanese-made competitors to come close to matching Gran Turismo itself. It was clearly a big project for Konami. It also has a fantastic soundtrack and a beautiful visual style. It doesn't feature quite the amount of content of something like GT4, but what's here is great. It has unique modes such as Enthusia Life, based around a ranking system and various weeks of races, as well as features to encourage clean driving. You lose points for going off-road or colliding with other drivers, for instance. I also want to highlight this beautiful car selection screen, which has the car spinning around slowly before rocketing up in speed using motion blur so that you can see all the different angles within a certain amount of time. It looks awesome. What stands out about this game the most, however, is the driving model itself. There's this well-known demonstration video that Konami put out back in the day, and as you can see, it's designed to show how closely Enthusia's physics match those of real-world cars. The knock-on effect of this, however, is that it's a very difficult game to play with a gamepad. It's clearly designed for a racing wheel. There's a lot to love once you get into it, but this hardcore driving model and the lower amount of content ensured that it wasn't quite the success I think Konami had hoped it would be. Our final competitor, however, is the one that did find success in a big way, Forza Motorsport. Microsoft has previously noted that Forza was designed specifically to compete with Gran Turismo, and out of every series that tried, this is the one that managed to pull it off, and Forza Motorsport for Xbox is their very first attempt. This one also released in 2005 after being delayed a few times, and it is a late game for the system, no doubt, considering that Xbox 360 was just around the corner. But while it might not match the sheer volume of content seen in GT4, it's extremely impressive as their first entry in the series, with plenty of tracks and 230 odd cars to drive. In many ways, this feels like an American muscle versus Japanese tuner car sort of situation, with its bombastic rock soundtrack and bold colors. It strikes a very different tone, but it works. Turn 10 opted to push hardware features of the Xbox with this game, including advanced shadow rendering, plenty of pixel shader goodness, and even Dolby Digital 5.1 for the sound. Gran Turismo is kind of lacking in terms of engine noises at this point, and I feel that Forza comes out ahead. The one caveat here though is frame rate. Forza is only 30 frames per second, which is kind of funny now because the rest of the Motorsport series has always targeted 60 frames per second instead. This is the one exception. So with our competitors established, let's step into the ring. I want to start here with Gran Turismo 4's version first. When looking at how the track is designed and presented, it's clear that each team took a very different approach. With GT4, Polyphony has opted for a somewhat overcast day with a hint of sun piercing through the clouds. The color scheme is grounded and earthy, and it treats the track with the sense of grandeur it deserves. It's a very evocative, beautiful version of the ring. Enthusia then strikes an even darker tone with a setting that can only be described as dusk before a storm. In that sense, it's one of my favorite takes on the track. It feels foreboding and moody. This is aided by the fact that it features an original song composed specifically for this track called Awakening Nürburgring Suite. This nearly 10-minute long track is designed to perfectly align with one lap on the ring, and man, it's awesome. Then we have Forza Motorsport, which takes a very different tone as well, with its guitar riffs rocking in the background and the moderately cloudy yet still blue skies above. Forza feels like a cool autumn day on the track. It's very refreshing in that sense. Compared to the others, many of the trees are barren with leaves scattered about the ground, and the color scheme perfectly channels that late October feel. Lastly, we have PGR2, which seems to take place at dawn perhaps, and is the least evocative of the bunch, I suppose. It becomes clear that the strengths with this game lie specifically with its city rendering, but it is neat to see how it stacks up, specifically how they tackled the terrain issue. Now, when looking at all four together, it is fascinating. The tone and rendering choices all differ between them. Also, the left side here is exclusively 30 frames per second, while the other side aims for 60. But on the left, you also get higher quality shadows, pixel shader effects, and in the case of Forza, this cool looking motion blur effect around the bottom of the car. GT4, however, seems to strike the most realistic tone here, I think. Polyphony seems to favor the more neutral, realistic look with their games, rather than aiming for brighter colors, and I do feel that actually works really well in this case. It feels very Germany, I can confirm that. This one also updates at 60 frames per second, of course, so it looks extra smooth in motion. Enthusia is the most curious of the bunch though, because technically it is missing some of the more advanced features. It's the only one here that is limited to 480i output and only outputs in 4x3, yet I still think Konami's art direction shines through, and the game offers a wonderful iteration of the ring. Honestly, looking at all four, I'm really impressed in general with the work of the developers on this one. There are some definite differences, of course. Tree placement varies between them, the types of trees used are all very different, the replication of the scenery, it's all unique in its own way, but the fact that we could see a track replicated so beautifully back in 2005, or even earlier in PGR2's case, is pretty awesome. So for the audience watching this video then, which of the four do you feel is the victor in capturing the essence of the Nürburgring? Be sure to let me know in comments or on social media. What you see here is what was once considered true state-of-the-art. As for GT4 itself, well, it was a huge success for the series, but ultimately looking back, the size and scope of the game is probably at least partially responsible for the troubled development that the next entry would see, Gran Turismo 5 on PlayStation 3. The need to match this amount of content while increasing the fidelity so much is a difficult thing. So, what happened with Gran Turismo after GT4? Let's briefly run down the situation. Well, first, when PlayStation Portable was revealed, Yamauchi himself announced a portable version of GT4 for PSP, but this release was delayed for many years before arriving on the market in 2009. It's a beautiful iteration of Gran Turismo though, with a huge range of tracks all translated over to portable form. It runs at 60 frames per second, features an option to install the game on your memory stick for quick loading, and even features a rudimentary form of TAA. It's a very unique game in that sense, but it's slightly let down by the fact that the progression system from prior GT games is not really present here. It's basically a bunch of single races that you can compete in to earn credits to buy more cars. It works well enough though for a portable game. In 2006, Polyphony unleashed another sim racing game on the world, this time focused on motorbikes, Tourist Trophy. It's derived from the work done on GT4 using that same engine, but with a focus on bike racing instead, and honestly, it's really good. We don't have enough time to cover this game in full for this episode, but it's out there. Later that year then, alongside the launch of PlayStation 3, Polyphony unleashed Gran Turismo HD. This is a small demo featuring one track and is basically a PS3 conversion of GT4's graphic engine, but with some minor improvements of course. Alongside Ridge Racer 7 though, GT HD is one of the few early PS3 games to run at a full HD 1080p at 60 frames per second, so it looked really nice at the time. Unfortunately, after this, the series would go into hibernation until the following year, where we would get GT5 Prologue, but we'd have to wait until 2010 for the actual release of Gran Turismo 5. The series would continue, of course, with GT6, GT Sport, and now 7, and in that sense, GT has never really left us, but it also never quite captured the feeling of those original games. The excitement around Gran Turismo and other racing games of that era cannot be understated. It was a very special time indeed. In fact, I really only scratched the surface here on many of the games mentioned in this episode, so be sure to let me know if you'd like to see further coverage of any of these titles or series, or cover some of the games I didn't get to include. Racing games are my passion, after all, and hopefully after this video, you've gained just a tiny bit of additional appreciation for classic digital motoring.
Hi everyone, I'm your best friend back in town again to get you on your dancing feet.
That sure was an adventure. I hope you enjoyed the trip as much as we did.